The engine made a sound it had never made before. A soft tick, almost like a clock counting down to midnight. Bumpy Johnson sat in the driver's seat of his pristine 1947 Cadillac, hands gripping the steering wheel as that foreign sound cut through the rumble of Harlem traffic. This wasn't mechanical wear, this was deliberate, this was a message. He pulled over on 125th Street, engine still running, mind already calculating. In his world, when something felt wrong, it usually was. And when your car started making sounds like a time bomb, you didn't drive to the nearest gas station. You thought about who wanted you dead. The tick persisted. Steady, methodical, like a heartbeat that didn't belong. Bumpy turned off the engine. Silence fell over the car like a funeral shroud. But that tick kept going. And it was coming from behind him. He stepped out slowly, scanning the street. Kids playing stickball, women hanging laundry, old men playing chess on milk crates. Normal Harlem life continuing while death potentially sat in his trunk. The irony wasn't lost on him. This is how it always happened in their world. Violence wrapped in the mundane. Death delivered with a smile. To understand what happened that night, you need to go back 3 weeks. Back to when Bumpy Johnson made a decision that would change everything. Back to when he chose to cross a line that most men wouldn't even approach. It started with a missing person, Tommy the Wrench Moretti, Italian kid from the Bronx who worked the garages along the East River. Good with engines, better with keeping his mouth shut, or so everyone thought. Tommy had a reputation in certain circles. If you needed a car fixed, he was your man. If you needed a car to disappear, he was also your man. If you needed someone to plant a little surprise under the hood, well, Tommy was very much your man. 3 weeks ago, Tommy had vanished. His garage stood empty, tools scattered like he'd left in a hurry. His neighbors said they'd seen nothing. His family claimed they knew nothing. But in Bumpy's world, when mechanics disappeared, it usually meant someone was cleaning house. The thing about Bumpy Johnson was this. He didn't just run numbers in Harlem. He protected it. Every street vendor who paid tribute. Every family who lived under his watch. Every working man who just wanted to come home safe. That protection meant something. It meant everything. And when word reached him that Tommy the Wrench had been grabbed while walking home from Luciano's social club, when whispers suggested the kid had been asking too many questions about a certain car bombing on 147th Street, Bumpy knew this wasn't just about a missing mechanic. This was about respect. This was about boundaries. This was about a message being sent to Harlem that their king couldn't protect his own people. Frank Costello's men had made their play. They'd snatched Tommy to send a signal. Even in Bumpy's territory, Italian muscle could reach anyone, anytime. They wanted Bumpy to know that his protection meant nothing against their power. They wanted him to feel helpless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The tick in the engine had been their calling card, their signature. Tommy's handiwork, no doubt applied under extreme duress. A reminder that they could touch Bumpy whenever they wanted. A psychological game designed to break him down slowly. But as Bumpy stood there on 125th Street, listening to that mechanical heartbeat coming from his trunk, he wasn't thinking about fear. He wasn't calculating escape routes or defensive moves. He was thinking about chess, about patience, about the difference between reacting and responding. Because what Frank Costello's boys didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson was this. When you came for the king of Harlem, you'd better not miss. And they had just given him exactly what he needed to destroy them completely. The tick continued, steady, insistent, like time itself was counting down to something inevitable. Bumpy reached for his trunk key, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Sometimes, he thought, your enemies give you the greatest gifts of all. But what he found in that trunk would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the true price of respect in a world where trust was the rarest currency of all. The trunk opened with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through Bumpy's soul. Inside, curled in a position that spoke of hours of agony, was Tommy, the Wrench Moretti. But Tommy wasn't dead. He was worse than dead. His hands had been systematically broken, every finger bent at unnatural angles. His face was a canvas of purple bruises and dried blood. His eyes held the hollow stare of a man who had seen hell and been forced to take notes. But he was breathing, barely, and in his broken hand, clutched like a lifeline, was a crumpled piece of paper. "Mr. Johnson," Tommy wheezed, his voice a ghost of what it used to be. They made me do things, terrible things to your car, but I wrote it all down." Bumpy knelt beside the trunk, his face a mask of controlled fury. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. This was about sending a message that crossed every line that separated civilization from chaos. The paper in Tommy's hand contained details that made Bumpy's blood run cold. Not just about the bomb they'd forced Tommy to plant. Not just about the timer mechanism designed to explode when the engine reached a specific temperature. But about something far worse, a list. Names, addresses, family members. Frank Costello hadn't just ordered Bumpy's assassination. He'd ordered the systematic elimination of everyone Bumpy cared about. His sister in Philadelphia. His cousin who ran a legitimate business in Brooklyn. The old woman who ran the corner store where Bumpy bought his morning coffee. This wasn't a mob hit. This was genocide. This was Costello's plan to erase not just Bumpy Johnson, but the very idea of Bumpy Johnson from the face of the earth. "They kept me in the warehouse on Pier 47, Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Made me watch while they planned everything. Mr. Johnson, they ain't just coming for you. They're coming for everybody." Bumpy helped Tommy out of the trunk, his mind already working 3 moves ahead. The warehouse. He knew it well. Costello's boys had been using it as their base of operations for months, thinking they were invisible, thinking Harlem was just another neighborhood they could conquer through fear and violence. They were about to learn the difference between intimidation and intelligence. "Tommy," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I need you to listen very carefully. You're going to walk into that police station on 135th Street. You're going to tell them exactly what happened to you. Every detail, every name." Tommy's eyes widened. "Mr. Johnson, I can't. They'll kill me. They'll kill my family." "No," Bumpy replied, his smile cold as winter steel. "They won't, because by the time you finish talking to the police, Frank Costello is going to have much bigger problems than one broken mechanic." What Tommy didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this moment for months. Every conversation in every social club, every meeting in every back room, every handshake and every promise made in the shadows of the city. Bumpy had been recording it all, not personally, of course, that would have been suicide, but through a network of bartenders, waitresses, shoeshine boys, and cleaning ladies who nobody ever noticed. People who were invisible to powerful men, but who saw and heard everything. For 6 months, Bumpy had been building the most comprehensive intelligence operation in the history of organized crime. While Costello's boys were playing with guns and threats, Bumpy was playing chess on a board they didn't even know existed. The warehouse on Pier 47 wasn't just their base of operations, it was their tomb. Because tomorrow night, when the FBI kicked down those doors, they wouldn't just find evidence of kidnapping and torture. They would find detailed records of every crime, every bribe, every murder that Frank Costello's organization had committed in the last 2 years. Bumpy had spent months feeding information to Agent Morrison, the one honest federal cop in New York City. A man whose daughter had been saved by Bumpy's protection when she'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. A man who understood the difference between justice and law. But Costello had made one crucial mistake. In his arrogance, in his belief that fear could conquer everything, he had shown his hand too early. He had revealed not just his plan to destroy Bumpy, but his plan to destroy everyone Bumpy loved. That wasn't business. That wasn't even personal. That was war. And Frank Costello had just declared it against the wrong man. As Tommy limped toward the police station, Bumpy watched from the shadows. Tomorrow, the newspapers would scream about the biggest mob bust in New York history. Tomorrow, Frank Costello would wake up to find his empire in ruins and his most trusted lieutenants singing to federal prosecutors. But tonight, Bumpy had one more piece of business to handle, because the bomb in his car wasn't the only surprise Costello's boys had left for him. Hidden in the engine compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth and connected to the same timer mechanism, was something that would change the game forever. Something that proved Frank Costello wasn't just trying to kill Bumpy Johnson. He was trying to frame him for the murder of a federal judge. And that meant tomorrow's arrests were just the beginning of a war that would reshape the entire criminal landscape of New York City. The federal judge was supposed to die tomorrow at 2:47 p.m. That's what the evidence would show. Judge Harrison Mackenzie, the one honest man left on the federal bench in New York City, would be driving to his courthouse when a car bomb would detonate. The same type of bomb that Tommy had been forced to build. The same signature that would point directly to Bumpy Johnson's operation. But what Frank Costello didn't know was that Judge Mackenzie was already dead. He had died 3 days ago of a heart attack in his study, surrounded by law books and unanswered prayers for a cleaner city. His family had kept it quiet, preparing for a private funeral. The only people who knew were his widow, his lawyer, and one federal agent who understood the value of strategic silence. Agent Morrison, the same agent who had been feeding information to Bumpy for months. The same man who understood that sometimes justice required working outside the boundaries of law. "You see, Frank," Bumpy murmured to himself as he stood in the abandoned warehouse that overlooked Pier 47. "That's the difference between us. You think with your fists, I think with my head." Through high-powered binoculars, he watched Costello's men moving equipment into the warehouse. They thought they were preparing for tomorrow's frame job. They thought they were setting up the perfect crime that would destroy Bumpy Johnson while eliminating a troublesome judge. They had no idea they were walking into the most elaborate trap in the history of organized crime. The setup had taken 6 months to orchestrate. 6 months of careful planning, strategic positioning, and the kind of patience that separated kings from pretenders. First, there was Maria Santos, Costello's cleaning lady, a woman whose son had been saved from a gang beating by one of Bumpy's men, a woman who had been dusting Costello's office and photographing his documents for half a year. Every plan, every meeting, every order. All of it carefully documented and passed along to Bumpy through a network that Costello never saw coming. Then there was Detective Raymond Murphy, Irish cop from the Bronx who had a gambling problem and a daughter who needed surgery. Costello thought he owned Murphy, but Bumpy had paid off Murphy's debts and covered his daughter's medical bills. When tomorrow's investigation began, Murphy would be the one collecting evidence, and he would find exactly what Bumpy wanted him to find. But the masterstroke was Judge Mackenzie himself. 3 days before his death, the judge had made a very specific request. He had asked Agent Morrison to visit him privately. In that meeting, he had signed a sealed warrant. A warrant that would be opened only in the event of his death. A warrant that authorized a massive federal investigation into organized crime activities at Pier 47. Mackenzie knew he was dying. His doctor had given him weeks to live. But he also knew that his death could serve justice in ways his life never could. When the bomb exploded tomorrow, it wouldn't kill a judge. It would trigger the largest federal investigation in New York history. And every piece of evidence would lead directly to Frank Costello's operation. Bumpy lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, the final pieces would fall into place. At exactly midnight, 3 things would happen simultaneously. First, Agent Morrison would execute the sealed warrant. Federal agents would surround Pier 47 from every direction. But they wouldn't move in immediately, they would wait and watch. Second, Detective Murphy would discover Tommy the Wrench Moretti's detailed confession at the police station. The same confession that implicated not just Costello's men in kidnapping and torture, but connected them to 17 unsolved murders across the 5 boroughs. Third, Maria Santos would deliver her final photographs to Bumpy, pictures that showed Costello's men loading not just bomb materials into the warehouse, but stolen federal evidence from 3 different crime scenes. Evidence that Costello had been using to blackmail judges, prosecutors, and police commanders for years. But Bumpy's real genius lay in what would happen next. At 12:30 a.m., a phone call would reach Frank Costello at his social club. An anonymous tip that Bumpy Johnson was planning to hit the warehouse at 1 a.m. Costello would rush to Pier 47 with his most trusted men, thinking he was about to catch his enemy in the act. Instead, he would walk directly into a federal task force that had been waiting for him all along. The beauty of it was biblical in its simplicity. Costello's own paranoia would deliver him into the hands of justice. His need to personally witness Bumpy's destruction would become the instrument of his own downfall. Standing in the shadows, watching his enemy's operation through the warehouse windows, Bumpy allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge. This wasn't even about respect. This was about something deeper. Something that went to the heart of what it meant to protect a community, what it meant to be a king. Frank Costello had made the mistake of thinking that power came from fear, that control came from violence, that respect could be beaten into people with brass knuckles and baseball bats, but real power came from something else entirely. It came from understanding people, from knowing their needs, their fears, their dreams, from building something larger than yourself. Costello had spent years trying to break Harlem, to turn its streets into another territory in his empire, to reduce its people to subjects who paid tribute out of terror. Bumpy had spent the same years building something better, a network of loyalty that wasn't based on fear but on mutual respect, a system where protection meant something, where a man's word was his bond and a handshake was worth more than any contract. Tomorrow, when the newspapers reported the massive federal bust at Pier 47, they would tell the story of Frank Costello's downfall. They would describe the evidence, the arrests, the shock of seeing one of the most powerful crime bosses in America led away in handcuffs. But they would miss the real story. They would miss the fact that this wasn't really about Bumpy Johnson versus Frank Costello. This was about two different philosophies of power, two different ways of understanding what it meant to rule. And tomorrow the city would learn which philosophy was stronger. Bumpy checked his watch again. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the beginning of the end. In his pocket, he carried one final surprise. A recording device that had been hidden in Frank Costello's office for the last 3 months. A device that had captured not just plans for murder and blackmail, but something far more valuable. A conversation between Costello and a federal prosecutor. A conversation that revealed the true scope of corruption in New York City. Names, dates, payments. A network of bribery that reached from the docks to the state capitol. When that recording was played tomorrow, it wouldn't just destroy Costello's organization. It would trigger a cleansing fire that would burn through every level of corruption in the city. The clock struck midnight. And in that moment, as federal agents moved into position around Pier 47, as Detective Murphy opened Tommy's confession at the police station, as Maria Santos handed over her final photographs, Bumpy Johnson smiled. Because sometimes justice wasn't about getting revenge on your enemies. Sometimes justice was about giving them exactly what they asked for. Frank Costello arrived at Pier 47 at exactly 12:47 a.m., just as Bumpy had calculated. He came with 8 of his best men, soldiers who had earned their reputation in blood across Brooklyn and the Bronx, men who thought they understood violence, men who believed that muscle could solve any problem. They had no idea they were walking into a masterpiece. "Sweep the warehouse," Costello ordered, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who had never truly been challenged. "If Johnson's in there, I want him alive. I want him to watch what happens to people who cross the Costello family." But the warehouse was empty. Just shadows and the smell of motor oil. Just the echo of footsteps and the growing realization that something was very, very wrong. That's when the lights came on. Not the warehouse lights. The spotlights. Dozens of them, blazing from every direction, turning night into day and exposing Costello's men like cockroaches caught in a kitchen at midnight. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" The voice boomed from speakers positioned around the entire pier. Agent Morrison's voice. The voice of justice finally finding its moment. Costello's men reached for their guns, but it was already too late. Red laser dots danced across their chests like deadly fireflies. 50 federal agents had surrounded the warehouse. 50 of the best marksmen in the FBI, all with orders to shoot to kill if anyone so much as breathed wrong. But Costello just stood there, looking around, understanding perhaps for the first time in his life what it felt like to be completely outmaneuvered. "You set me up," he said to the darkness. his voice carrying a mixture of rage and something that might have been respect. That's when Bumpy Johnson stepped into the light. He didn't emerge from hiding. He didn't sneak out of the shadows. He simply walked through the front door of the warehouse like he owned the place, which in a way he did. "No, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice calm as Sunday morning. "You set yourself up. I just gave you the rope." Costello's face twisted with fury. "You think you won something here, Johnson? You think the feds are going to protect you forever? I got people. I got connections. I'll be out in 6 months, and when I am—" "No," Bumpy interrupted, pulling a small recording device from his pocket. "You won't." He pressed play. Costello's own voice filled the night air, clear as a church bell, damning as a confession booth. "The judge has got to go. Mackenzie's been causing too many problems. Make it look like Johnson did it. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone." But that wasn't all. The recording continued, Costello's voice discussing bribes to federal prosecutors, names, amounts, dates, a conversation about eliminating witnesses, plans to expand his operation into Philadelphia and Chicago. 3 months of Frank Costello's private conversations. 3 months of him revealing every crime, every bribe, every murder he had ordered or planned. Costello's face went white, not with fear, with the terrible understanding that he had been played by a master. "You see, Frank," Bumpy continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute victory, "that's the difference between us. You thought this was about territory, about who controlled what streets. You thought this was about respect earned through fear." Agent Morrison approached with handcuffs, his face set in the grim satisfaction of a man who had waited years for this moment. "But it was never about any of that," Bumpy said as the cuffs clicked around Costello's wrists. "It was about understanding people, about building something real, about loyalty that goes both ways." The recording device continued playing. More conversations, more evidence, enough to put Costello away for life and dismantle his entire organization. "Maria Santos," Bumpy explained as Costello was led away. "You're a cleaning lady. Funny thing about people you don't notice. They notice everything." But the real genius of Bumpy's plan wasn't the recordings. It wasn't even the federal sting operation. It was what happened next. As Costello was loaded into a federal transport vehicle, a second wave of arrests began across the city. Corrupt cops, dirty prosecutors, judges who had been taking Costello's money for years. The recording device had captured more than just Costello's crimes. It had captured the names of everyone he had bought, everyone who had enabled his empire, everyone who had looked the other way while he poisoned the city with corruption. By sunrise, the entire structure of organized crime in New York would be in federal custody. Not just Costello's men, but the network of corruption that had protected them. The lawyers, the judges, the politicians who had made their crimes possible. Detective Murphy was already at work, discovering evidence that would connect Costello's organization to dozens of unsolved murders. Tommy the Wrench Moretti was giving a statement that would put half the Italian crime families in New York behind bars. And Judge Mackenzie. Judge Mackenzie's death had triggered the sealed warrant that made all of this legal. His final act had been to authorize the largest organized crime bust in American history. "How long have you been planning this?" Agent Morrison asked as they watched the transport vehicles disappear into the night. Bumpy smiled. "Since the day I realized that Frank Costello thought Harlem was something he could take. Since the moment he forgot that respect isn't something you steal. It's something you earn." The newspapers would call it the Pier 47 Roundup. They would write about the shock of seeing America's most powerful crime boss led away in chains. They would describe the evidence, the recordings, the systematic dismantling of organized crime in New York City. But they would miss the real story. The real story was about a man who understood that true power doesn't come from fear. It comes from loyalty. It comes from protecting something bigger than yourself. It comes from building a community where people matter. Frank Costello had tried to rule through intimidation. He had believed that violence could conquer anything, that corruption could buy anyone. He had learned too late that he was wrong. As the sun began to rise over Harlem, Bumpy Johnson walked home through streets that belonged to him not because he had taken them by force, but because he had earned them through respect. The king was still the king, and his kingdom was stronger than ever. But this victory would come with a price that even Bumpy couldn't have anticipated. If you think Frank Costello got exactly what he deserved, hit that like button, because this story isn't over yet. 6 months after the Pier 47 roundup, Frank Costello sat in a federal penitentiary cell, staring at walls that would contain him for the rest of his natural life. No visitors, no respect, no empire. The man who once controlled half of New York's criminal underworld now spent his days mopping floors and dodging inmates who saw him as either a target or a joke. The recordings had destroyed more than his organization. They had destroyed his legend, his mystique, his power. In the outside world, every newspaper had carried the story. Every radio program had dissected his downfall. Every criminal in America had learned the same lesson. When you come for a king, you better not miss. Frank Costello had missed, spectacularly. But the real story of that night wasn't about Costello's fall. It was about what rose in its place. Within a week of the arrests, something remarkable had happened in Harlem. The streets became safer. Not because of increased police presence, not because of federal intervention, but because of something far more powerful. Respect. Real respect. The kind that builds communities instead of destroying them. The network of loyalty that Bumpy Johnson had spent years building didn't just survive Costello's attempted takeover, it thrived. Businesses flourished. Families felt protected. Children played in parks that had been war zones just months before. Tommy the Wrench Moretti had recovered from his injuries and opened a legitimate auto repair shop on 125th Street. Federal protection had kept him safe during the trials, but it was Bumpy's protection that kept him safe after. The kind of protection that came from being part of something bigger than yourself. Maria Santos had used her reward money from the FBI to open a small restaurant. Every federal agent who had participated in the Pier 47 operation knew they were welcome there. But more importantly, every person from the neighborhood knew they belonged there. Detective Murphy had been promoted to lieutenant. His gambling debts were gone. His daughter was healthy, and he had learned something about the difference between being owned and being respected. Agent Morrison had received a commendation from the director of the FBI, but more than that, he had learned something about justice that they didn't teach at Quantico. Sometimes the law needed help from people who understood the streets better than any textbook ever could. The sealed warrant that Judge Mackenzie had signed before his death had triggered more than just the Pier 47 operation. It had authorized a complete investigation into organized crime corruption throughout New York City. 17 judges had been removed from the bench. 43 police officers had been arrested. 6 federal prosecutors had been indicted. The city had been cleansed by fire. And from those ashes, something better had emerged. But perhaps the most important legacy of that night was something that couldn't be measured in arrests or convictions or newspaper headlines. It was the lesson that every criminal in America had learned about Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't just the king of Harlem anymore. He was something more dangerous, something more permanent. He was a symbol of what happened when intelligence met integrity, when patience met purpose, when community meant more than conquest. The Italian families had tried to expand into his territory and learned that some ground is sacred. The corrupt officials had tried to buy him and learned that some men can't be purchased. The federal government had tried to use him and learned that some partnerships are built on mutual respect, not mutual exploitation. 3 years later, a young journalist from the Amsterdam News would ask Bumpy Johnson about that night, about how he had managed to outmaneuver one of the most powerful crime bosses in America, about how he had turned certain death into total victory. Bumpy's answer would become legend in the streets of Harlem. Frank Costello made the same mistake that powerful men always make. He had said, sitting in his office above the Apollo Theater, surrounded by photographs of jazz legends and community heroes. He thought that fear could replace respect. He thought that violence could substitute for wisdom. He thought that taking something made you own it. The journalist had pressed for more details, more specifics about the planning, the recordings, the network of informants. But Bumpy had simply smiled and shaken his head. Son, he had said, the real secret wasn't in the plan. It was in understanding something that Costello never learned. Power isn't about what you can take from people. Power is about what you can give them. Protection, opportunity, hope. A place where their children can grow up safe. A community where a man's word means something, where loyalty runs both ways. Costello spent years trying to break Harlem, trying to turn it into another piece of his empire. But you can't break something that's built on love. You can't conquer something that's protected by family. The journalist had asked one final question, whether Bumpy ever regretted the violence, whether he ever wished things could have been different. Bumpy had looked out his window at the streets below, at the children playing safely in the parks, at the businesses thriving under his protection, at the community that had survived every attempt to destroy it. Regret? He had said. Son, the only thing I regret is that it took Frank Costello so long to understand the lesson. In this life, you get to choose who you want to be. You can be someone who takes or someone who gives, someone who destroys or someone who builds, someone who rules through fear, or someone who leads through love. Frank Costello chose destruction. He chose fear. He chose to be the kind of man who would torture an innocent mechanic to send a message. I chose differently. The journalist had published that interview, but it would be years before people truly understood what Bumpy Johnson had accomplished that night at Pier 47. He hadn't just defeated a crime boss. He hadn't just saved his own life. He hadn't just protected his territory. He had proven something about the nature of power itself, something about the difference between authority and respect, something about the kind of strength that builds kingdoms instead of destroying them. Today, more than 70 years later, the name Frank Costello is a footnote in history books, a cautionary tale about the price of arrogance. But the name, Bumpy Johnson, that name still means something in the streets of Harlem. It means protection. It means integrity. It means the kind of power that comes from understanding that true strength isn't about what you can take from people. It's about what you can give them. The tick in the engine had been meant to announce his death. Instead, it had announced the birth of a legend. And that legend lives on today, in every community leader who chooses service over self-interest, in every person who stands up to bullies, in every individual who understands that real power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Frank Costello thought he was sending Bumpy Johnson a message about fear. Instead, he had taught the world a lesson about fearlessness. And that lesson echoes still in the streets where kings are made not by conquest, but by character. If you learned something from this story about real power and respect, make sure to hit that like button. Because legends like this remind us that sometimes the good guys really do win.